I'm joined today by Colin Moriarty, who is the creator of Colin's Last Stand. You can find him on YouTube and elsewhere. A lot of people in the audience actually said, Colin, you should really talk to Colin. He's doing the rounds. He is a growing libertarian voice, and we'll talk to you about whether you agree with that sort of identification. So maybe we'll start there. I mean, how do you identify politically? Is libertarian fair? I know your Twitter handle is no taxation, which reeks of libertarianism to me, but maybe that's just one issue.
Yeah, the no taxation reference is a reference to the American Revolution. I'm obviously I believe in low taxation, but it's really more a reference to no taxation without representation. And I went to school at Northeastern University in your neck of the woods, I think, and majored in American history. So that was really more a reference to that. But I feel personally that I'm a moderate conservative. Specifically because I used to call myself a libertarian before I really started to think that I actually am not a libertarian, specifically with the role of government and all of those kinds of things. I'm more a libertarian on the social side. So I think it's more accurate to call myself like a moderate conservative.
So have your politics changed over time, or has this basically been your political paradigm for, I don't know, as long as you've paid attention to politics?
I honestly feel like I've gotten more liberal as I've gotten older, which is unusual. They always say that you kind of get more conservative as you get older. But
Yeah, but they are wrong. I mean, I don't know if you've looked into the data on that. It's deceptive because if you do a poll and segment it by age groups, at any given time, the older age groups will be more conservative than the younger age groups. But the reason isn't because people become more conservative as they age, is because subsequent generations tend to be more progressive and remain so during their lives. So that's a common, you just have to look into the data on that one. But yes, you're right. That's a common phrase you hear thrown around.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought as a young, when I became politically cognizant in really middle school and high school, I was interested in reading a bunch of different things, and I had friends that were reading more like Marxist literature and stuff like that, which is interesting. And then when I got to college, I kind of was more, I voted, the first presidential election I voted in was 2004, and I voted for Bush. And I think I was a little bit more hardline conservative, never really socially, but more in terms of foreign policy and the role of government. And as I've gotten older, and maybe it's from 10 years living in San Francisco, and now I'm in Santa Monica, I was kind of softened a little bit on some of those things. But I honestly think that what was missing with conservatism was consistency and decency. And that was kind of a main line for me to kind of chase with my new project.
On what particular issue do you feel, or did you feel, that decency was missing from conservatism?
I think with social policies, I feel like, a woman's right to choose seems to me inherently a conservative principle, because it's a principle that says you should leave the person alone to make their own choices. The same thing with gay marriage. I was a vociferous and loud proponent of gay marriage when we voted in 2008 here in California, which obviously failed. So even back then, I felt like there's not a decency in terms of the way we look at others, the way we treat others, that a transgender person has the right to live a life unencumbered by government interference, even with the military, that a gay man has the right to marry another gay man, has the right to adopt a child. I feel like these are inherent principles that actually line up with conservatism, if conservatism to you means the government has no, or a limited role in your life, just like they have a limited role in telling you you can't have a gun, they have a limited role in other ways. I just feel like there's a massive inconsistency there, and I don't like the way, and I still don't like the way that republicanism and conservatism treats the gay groups and transgender groups and the like.
See, to me, it sounds more libertarian than Republican, and maybe that's the argument you're making, which is that in reality, you represent what you think conservatism or republicanism should be. But even the language you're using to me sounds very, very libertarian in a sense. I mean, I researched a little bit some of your foreign policy positions, and to give one, if I'm misstating it, obviously, please correct me. It seems as though you do tend to take more of a Rand Paul approach on foreign policy in terms of non-interventionism, except when the United States is really clearly and directly threatened, not meddling in the affairs of other countries in the sort of form of the policeman of the United States. Is that true? Because that, at least over the last 20 years, is more aligned with libertarianism than republicanism.
Well, I think that was one of the major shifts, and why I think that it's a totally valid argument or conversation to have about the definition of libertarianism and my own libertarianism. And I'm sure we'll get into other things that are decidedly not libertarian. that I feel. But when I was in college, we were talking about Bush and my time at Northeastern. I was really for the war in Iraq, and I really was for the war in Afghanistan, and kind of seeing through our own lens the failure of those conflicts, particularly in Iraq, and how that kind of spread to a larger Middle East unrest in my mind, kind of showed me that an interventionist foreign policy, a neoconservative foreign policy, really makes no sense. And when you look back at Vietnam and you look back at Korea and you look at these wars of containment, for instance, they didn't really solve anything. I don't think the United States shouldn't get involved in anything that doesn't necessarily affect it. Otherwise, we never really had a fight in the European theater in World War II, and obviously that was the right thing to do, and we probably should have gotten involved earlier.
Yeah,
So
I mean, the
think
counter to that would
sorry.
be we got involved after Pearl Harbor most acutely, and that was when we got involved because we were directly attacked. But not to sort of rehash World War II history in full.
Right. Well, that was the Pacific theater. We could have taken the Japanese much quicker. Remember that we inserted troops into Africa and over into Italy, 42, 43.
Yep.
Lend-Lease was going on with Europe. But we could have focused on the Pacific theater, ended that way sooner, probably without nuclear bombs, and ignored what was going on in Europe. And I don't think that was the right choice. So I just wanted to be clear that there are sometimes heinous and terrible things that don't necessarily involve us that we should still do something about. And I think obviously Nazi Germany was one of those things. But when we look at Korea, we look at Vietnam, I just see a lineage of these failed wars and these failed conflicts. And while I feel we should have the most powerful military in the world, the greatest arsenal, the best trained soldiers, we have all of that already. It doesn't mean we have to use it.
Where are you in terms of this phrase that's sometimes thrown around? And I ask this again because of where we started on taxation. The idea that taxation is theft, and I won't qualify it any further than that and sort of turn it over to you. Is that a phrase, as I present it, taxation is theft, that resonates with you, or do you have disagreements with that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that statement. I think taxation, to a certain degree, is the cost of living in a society, and that's obviously, a common phrase. My dad used to use this term. My dad is very political, and we've had a lot of political conversations in my life. He says that taxation gets to a point of being confiscatory. In other words, there's a reasonable level of taxation and a taxation where they basically are stealing from you or taking too much. And I think that's a line worth drawing. I think when you look at your, the funds that you make gross every year, let's say you make $100,000, and then the government right off the top takes 30% of that or so, and then the state government here in California can take up to 13.3% of that, depending on your income bracket. And then you're paying sales tax. Sales tax here in Santa Monica is 10%. So you're as you're getting hammered over and over again, taxation does get out of control. And so I believe that we have to pay some taxes. I believe that there are things we should be doing together. And I was actually against this recent tax reform because it adds to the deficit. But I feel as if there's a reasonable level of taxation and an unreasonable level of taxation. And I'm for making it more reasonable. I think it's far out of the bounds of reason right now.
I mean, part for me, and I'm curious to hear your thought, is one side of it is in the sort of abstract, what level of taxation is or isn't reasonable, and not everybody will agree what that is, but that's sort of one side of the equation. The other side is, what do you get for the taxes that you pay? Is that something you're also concerned about? Because certainly if you're concerned about military intervention, the spending on defense is pretty closely behind that. And then I'm in a position where I can talk about reasonable and unreasonable levels of taxation, but it has to be in the context of what are we getting for that, particularly when we look at what some other countries get for the tax rates that they have.
Yes, it is a huge concern of mine about what we get out of our tax money. I've long been a proponent of cutting military spending significantly, and I think that we could probably afford across the board spending cuts that can then maybe trickle down towards, and I know the term trickle down is loaded, but I mean trickle down towards the taxpayer if possible, an audit of our spending. I feel like there's a lack of concern with the American people, and certainly a lack of concern with our representatives in the House and in the Senate with how judiciously money is spent. And I think that we can cut waste everywhere. And even if we're cutting waste only $10 million here, $50 million there, $5 million there, that does start to add up. That's real money. And so I think we should look at what we're getting out of our tax spending. And I feel like we don't really get very much. I mean, that's my personal take. But I'm also in a privileged position economically. I grew up on Long Island in New York. So, I mean, this is not a depressed area. So I know that it's easy for me to say those kinds of things. but I think that we could probably cut spending significantly. I think the government's too big. But
Yeah,
again,
although I mean, but are
I'm
you
sorry.
making the argument that that would be good economically? Because at this point, there's increasingly more and more economic thinking that suggests that actually even a focus on the debt is irrelevant. That would be like the modern monetary theory approach. But even stepping back from that, even just looking historically at the impact of supply side economics more broadly, it's really unclear that you can cut your way to any kind of economic improvements anyway.
Yeah, that might be true, and in fact, that is again a valid argument to be had. I'm not looking at it so much from an economic benefit or an economic deficit,
Okay.
although that matters. I'm really looking at it more in terms of principle.
Yeah.
And I don't like getting too caught up on principle, but the idea that if you're giving a dollar to the government, shouldn't they spend that dollar in the best way possible? And if they're not, shouldn't you have really serious questions about it, regardless of the economic benefit or the economic deficit of, say, spending and its effect on the larger economy? Which I think is a different conversation entirely. For me, I just feel like we should spend what is reasonable. We should get back what is reasonable, and anything apart from that, no matter how much we're spending or how little we're spending, should be discussed because it is our money, and it's important that we spend it wisely. And as far as the debt and all those kinds of things, I know that there's this argument, a valid argument. Again, I think I'm not an economist, that it doesn't really matter. We can continue to spend our way into debt, but I just don't believe that, because if it's true, then why not just print $5 trillion a year?
Well, that's effectively what we do, and really we haven't had that significant inflation. I mean, I would encourage you to check out the work of people like Stephanie Kelton and Paulina Cherneva and some of the other folks in modern monetary theory, because that's exactly what they're saying, which is we do that, and depending on what we do it for, the idea that inflation gets completely out of control, it wouldn't happen, it hasn't happened. But anyway, that may be a conversation for another moment. Before we move off of taxes, do you agree with me that taxation is theft is sort of a losing libertarian argument, in the sense that I think that there are lots of people who sort of identify either as left or right who might be more drawn to some of the reasonable libertarian ideas that exist. But when libertarians take these absolutist views of taxation is theft or even slavery, I've heard that they're sort of doing their own movement a disservice. Do you agree, or do you disagree on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that there's a cartoonishness, frankly, to libertarianism, to big L libertarianism, that I feel is a turnoff because it's not pragmatic. It's not rooted in the 21st century. It's not even rooted in the 20th century. And as much as I love Ayn Rand, and as much as I love the more philosophical or high-level thought of a libertarian utopia where the government isn't involved and everyone lives a sort of free life, it's not the way it is. And in a society of 325 million people, we have to have some sort of social contract with each other in terms of money, in terms of spending, in terms of infrastructure, et cetera, that makes sense for all of us. So it doesn't mean we have to have 25 cabinet level positions or whatever in the future. It doesn't mean that we can't trim and cut and make things more coherent and smaller. But in terms of taxation as theft, it's a funny thing to say, but it really doesn't make any sense. Because again, I'll say that taxation isn't theft until it reaches a certain point, at which point I would say it's more confiscation and less theft.
All right, let's pause there. We're speaking with Colin Moriarty, creator of Colin's Last Stand. You can find him on YouTube and elsewhere. We will pick up our conversation with him tomorrow.